The grizzly's roar shattered the mountain silence, and Tabitha Foster's basket of wild raspberries tumbled to the ground as 800 pounds of fur and fury charged straight toward her through the pine trees of northern Arizona. It was July 1878, and Tabitha had ventured perhaps too far from the modest homestead she shared with her widowed father on the outskirts of Williamson's, a rough timber town nestled in the ponderosa pine forests. At 22 years old, she knew the dangers of these mountains, but the raspberry bushes grew thick and heavy here, and her father loved her preserves. She had been humming softly to herself, lost in the simple pleasure of picking berries in the dappled sunlight, when she heard the distinctive snap of branches behind her. The bear had likely been feeding on the same berry patch from the other side. Tabitha had startled it, and now the massive creature was closing the distance between them with terrifying speed, its eyes fixed on her, saliva flying from its open jaws. To Tabitha's scream caught in her throat. Her legs refused to move. She was going to die here, alone in these woods, torn apart by claws as long as her fingers. Then a figure materialized between her and certain death. He was the largest man Tabitha had ever seen, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a thick beard that couldn't hide the hard line of his jaw. His buckskin shirt stretched tight across a chest and arms corded with muscle, and in his right hand he held nothing but a hunting knife with a blade maybe 10 inches long. The mountain man didn't run, he didn't even flinch. He planted his feet wide and let out a roar of his own, deep and primal, that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Tabitha's feet. The grizzly hesitated for just a heartbeat, confused by this brazen challenge from something so much smaller than itself. But its momentum carried it forward, and the bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over the man who dared stand in its path. "Get back!" the man shouted to Tabitha without taking his eyes off the bear. His voice was rough, unused to regular conversation. "Move slowly, don't run." Tabitha's feet finally obeyed, carrying her backward one trembling step at a time. Her eyes were locked on the scene before her, unable to look away even though every instinct screamed at her to flee. The bear came down with a thunderous crash, its massive paws swinging toward the man's head with enough force to decapitate him. But the mountain man was already moving, ducking under the blow with surprising speed for someone his size. He lunged forward, driving his knife deep into the bear's shoulder, then wrenched it free and danced back before the creature could retaliate. Blood darkened the grizzly's fur, and it bellowed in pain and rage. It charged again and again. The man sidestepped at the last possible moment, his blade finding flesh. This time he slashed across the bear's snout, opening a deep gash that sent blood streaming into its eyes. Tabitha had backed up perhaps 20 feet now, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle her gasps of terror. She should run, she knew she should run. But she couldn't abandon this stranger who had thrown himself between her and death without a moment's hesitation. The dance between man and beast continued, and Tabitha began to understand that the mountain man wasn't trying to kill the grizzly. He was trying to hurt it enough to make it leave, to convince it that this fight wasn't worth the trouble. Each strike was precise, calculated to wound but not to enrage the bear beyond reason. The grizzly swung again, and this time its claws caught the edge of the man's buckskin shirt, shredding the leather and leaving 4 parallel lines of red across his ribs. He grunted but didn't slow down, circling to keep the bear focused on him rather than the woman behind him. "When I say run," he called out, his breathing heavy but controlled, "you run straight back the way you came. Don't stop. Don't look back." "I won't leave you," Tabitha heard herself say, and she meant it with a fierceness that surprised her. The man risked a glance over his shoulder, and for just a moment their eyes met. His were pale blue, startling against his sun-darkened skin, and something passed between them in that instant, some wordless understanding that neither could name. The bear charged once more, perhaps sensing its opponent's momentary distraction. The mountain man spun back just in time, but his foot caught on an exposed root and he stumbled. The grizzly's paw came down like a hammer, and only a desperate roll to the side saved the man from being crushed. He came up in a crouch, blood from his torn ribs staining his shirt darker, his knife still gripped firmly in his hand. The bear advanced more slowly now, limping slightly from the wounds it had taken. Both combatants were breathing hard, assessing each other. "Go," the man shouted to Tabitha, but Tabitha had spotted something. A large branch, thick as her forearm and nearly as tall as she was, lay among the fallen pine needles just a few feet away. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it hard against the nearest tree trunk. The crack echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The grizzly's head swiveled toward her, and for a heart-stopping moment, Tabitha thought she had made a fatal mistake. But the bear was tired and hurting, and this new threat was apparently the last straw. With a final huff of annoyance, the massive creature turned and lumbered away into the deeper woods, leaving a trail of blood drops on the pine needles. The mountain man straightened slowly, still watching the direction the bear had gone, his knife held ready. Only when the sounds of the grizzly's retreat had faded completely did he lower his weapon and turn to face Tabitha. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said, his chest still heaving from exertion. "I have not decided which." "You saved my life," Tabitha breathed, her own legs suddenly feeling weak as the terror of what had just happened crashed over her. "You could have been killed. Better than letting an innocent woman get mauled." He walked toward her, and Tabitha could see the blood seeping through his shirt more clearly now. The bear's claws had carved deep furrows across his ribs, and smaller cuts marked his forearms where he had blocked other strikes. "You are hurt." Tabitha moved toward him instinctively, her hands reaching out before she remembered herself and pulled back. "Those wounds need tending. I have had worse." But even as he said it, she saw him wince when he took a deep breath. "You should get back to town. That bear might decide to come back, or its mate might be nearby." "Not without you," Tabitha said firmly. "You cannot walk back to wherever you came from losing blood like that. Come with me to my father's homestead. It is not far from here, perhaps a mile. We can tend your injuries properly there." The mountain man studied her for a long moment, and Tabitha found herself studying him right back. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps only 27 or 28, though the weathered quality of his skin made him seem older. His face was all hard planes and angles, the face of a man who had spent years in these mountains surviving on his own terms. But his eyes, those startling blue eyes, held a depth of loneliness that made her heart ache. "I do not want to be any trouble," he said finally. "You just fought a grizzly bear with nothing but a knife to save my life," Tabitha replied, feeling a sudden urge to laugh even though nothing was particularly funny. "I think a little trouble is the least I owe you. What is your name?" "Jacob," he said after a pause. "Jacob Hart, Tabitha Foster." She bent to retrieve her fallen basket, gathering the scattered berries back into it with shaking hands. "Come, Jacob Hart, let us get you somewhere safe." Jacob hesitated a moment longer, then nodded and fell into step beside her. Tabitha noticed he positioned himself between her and the direction the bear had gone, still protecting her even with his own blood staining his clothes. Something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in her chest at the realization. They walked in silence for a time, following the faint trail Tabitha had made on her way to the berry patch. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall pines, painting everything in shades of gold and green. Birds had begun singing again, their earlier alarm at the commotion fading. "How long have you been in these mountains?" Tabitha asked, partially because she was genuinely curious and partially because she worried about Jacob's growing pallor. "Keep him talking, keep him conscious." 3 years, Jacob said. His voice was rough but not unpleasant, like stone smoothed by a river. "Maybe 4. I lose track of time up here. Do you live alone?" "Yes, that must be lonely." Jacob glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I prefer it that way." Tabitha wanted to ask why, wanted to know what had driven a man to choose solitude in these harsh mountains over the company of other people. But she could see the lines of pain tightening around his eyes, and she knew this was not the time for such questions. The homestead came into view as they crested a small rise. It was modest, just a sturdy log cabin with a small barn and a chicken coop, surrounded by the towering pines that dominated this part of Arizona. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Tabitha felt a rush of relief. Her father was home. "Papa!" she called out as they approached. "Papa, I need help." The cabin door burst open, and Theodore Foster emerged with his hunting rifle already in hand. He was a lean man in his early 50s, his hair and beard more silver than brown, his face lined with the hardships of frontier life. His eyes widened when he saw his daughter approaching with a blood-soaked stranger at her side. "Tabitha, what happened?" He hurried toward them, his rifle now pointed safely at the ground. "Are you hurt?" "I am fine, Papa. But this is Jacob Hart, and he saved me from a grizzly bear. He is wounded and needs our help." Theodore's sharp eyes took in the shredded shirt and the blood, and his expression shifted from alarm to gratitude. "Come inside, son, quickly now. Tabitha, get the medical kit and some clean water boiling." Between the two of them, they managed to get Jacob into the cabin and seated in one of the sturdy wooden chairs at the kitchen table. Tabitha rushed to stoke the fire and set a kettle of water to boil while her father carefully helped Jacob remove what was left of his buckskin shirt. The wounds were worse than Tabitha had feared. 4 deep gashes ran from Jacob's right shoulder blade across his ribs, the edges ragged and still bleeding freely. Smaller cuts and scrapes marked his arms and chest, evidence of how close the bear's claws had come to ending his life. "I have seen bear maulings before," Theodore said grimly as he examined the wounds. "You are lucky to be alive, young man. Most men do not walk away from a grizzly." "Most men do not have much choice," Jacob said through gritted teeth. "I could not let it hurt your daughter." Theodore's eyes met Jacob's, and something passed between the two men, some understanding that needed no words. "You have my deepest gratitude, Mr. Hart. Tabitha is all I have in this world." The water came to a boil, and Tabitha poured it into a basin along with some whiskey from her father's small store. She gathered clean cloths and the medical supplies they kept on hand, her movements efficient despite the trembling in her hands. She had helped her father tend wounds before, both on people and animals, but somehow this felt different, more personal. "This is going to hurt," Theodore warned as he soaked a cloth in the whiskey solution. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I know." Tabitha moved to stand in front of him, and without thinking about propriety or whether it was appropriate, she took his left hand in both of hers. "Squeeze as hard as you need to," she said softly. Jacob looked up at her, and once again their eyes met. This time the look held longer, and Tabitha felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. Then Theodore began cleaning the wounds, and Jacob's hand clamped down on hers with crushing force. But he did not cry out, did not make a sound beyond a harsh intake of breath. He kept his eyes locked on Tabitha's face, as if drawing strength from her presence, and she held his gaze steadily, trying to pour all her gratitude and admiration into that wordless connection. It took nearly an hour to clean and dress all the wounds properly. The cuts across Jacob's ribs would need stitching, which Theodore did with the careful precision of a man who had sewn up his share of injuries over the years. Through it all, Jacob remained silent except for the occasional sharp breath, his hand never leaving Tabitha's. When it was finally done, Jacob slumped slightly in the chair, his face pale beneath his tan. Theodore stepped back, wiping his bloody hands on a cloth. "You will need to rest here for a few days at least," Theodore said firmly. "Those stitches need time to set, and you have lost a fair amount of blood. We have a spare room, small but comfortable. I insist you stay until you are strong enough to travel safely." "I do not want to impose," Jacob started, but Theodore cut him off with a raised hand. "You saved my daughter's life. That is a debt I can never fully repay, but I will not have you bleeding out in the woods because you were too stubborn to accept help. You will stay, and that is final." Jacob looked between Theodore and Tabitha, and whatever he saw in their faces made him relent. "Thank you," he said simply. "I am grateful." "Come," Tabitha said, gently tugging his hand. "Let me show you where you can rest." She led him through the small cabin to a tiny room at the back that served as storage and occasional guest quarters. It held a narrow bed, a small table, and little else, but it was clean and private. Jacob sank onto the bed with visible relief, his strength clearly waning. "I will bring you some food," Tabitha said, lingering in the doorway. "You need to eat to regain your strength." "Tabitha," Jacob said, and the sound of her name in his rough voice sent a shiver down her spine. "Thank you for the branch, for not running when I told you to." "Thank you for being brave enough to stand between me and that bear," Tabitha replied softly. "Not many men would have done what you did. Any decent man would have." "Perhaps," Tabitha said, "but you are the one who was there. You are the one who risked everything for a stranger." She paused, her heart beating faster than it should. "Rest now, we can talk more later." She closed the door softly and returned to the kitchen, where her father was cleaning up the bloody cloths and putting away the medical supplies. He looked up as she entered, his expression thoughtful. "That is quite a man," Theodore said quietly. "Living alone in these mountains, surviving by his wits and strength, takes a certain kind of person to manage that." "He seems very capable," Tabitha agreed, busying herself with preparing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold venison. Her hands were still shaking slightly from the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. "More than capable." Theodore paused, choosing his words carefully. "He looked at you the way a drowning man looks at solid ground." Tabitha felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Papa, you are imagining things. We only just met under terrible circumstances." "I know what I saw," Theodore said, but his tone was gentle. "And I saw the way you looked at him too. Like you had found something precious you did not know you were searching for." "That is ridiculous," Tabitha protested weakly. "I am grateful to him, certainly. He saved my life. But anything beyond that is simply not possible. We are strangers." Theodore smiled, the expression making him look years younger. "Your mother and I were strangers once too. We met when she was traveling through with a wagon train, and I was scouting for the army. 3 weeks later we were married. When you know, you know." Tabitha's throat tightened at the mention of her mother, who had died from pneumonia 5 winters ago. She still missed her every single day, missed her wisdom and her warmth and her unwavering faith that everything would work out as it should. "I will take him some food," Tabitha said. Deflecting the conversation, she arranged a plate with generous portions and poured a cup of cool water from their cistern. She knocked softly on Jacob's door, and his voice bade her enter. He was sitting up against the wall, his bandaged torso looking stark white against his tan skin. Someone, her father presumably, had provided him with a clean shirt, though he had not yet put it on. Tabitha tried not to stare at the impressive breadth of his shoulders, at the way muscles defined his chest and arms despite the fresh injuries. He was built like the mountains themselves, all solid strength and rugged endurance. "I brought you food," she said, setting the plate and cup on the small table beside his bed. "You should eat what you can." "Thank you." Jacob reached for the plate, and Tabitha saw him wince as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Let me," she said impulsively, sitting on the edge of the bed and picking up the bread herself. She tore off a piece and held it out to him, a strangely intimate gesture that made her acutely aware of how close they were sitting. Jacob hesitated, then took the bread from her fingers, their skin brushing briefly. "You do not need to do this," he said quietly. "I am not an invalid." "No, you are a man who fought a grizzly bear this afternoon and nearly died because of it. Let someone take care of you for a change." Something in his expression softened, and he accepted another piece of bread when she offered it. They fell into an easy rhythm, Tabitha preparing each bite and Jacob accepting it, their silence comfortable rather than awkward. "Tell me about yourself," Jacob said after a while. "How does a woman like you end up in these woods picking berries alone, a woman like me?" Tabitha raised an eyebrow. "What kind of woman do you think I am?" "Brave," Jacob said immediately. "Kind, beautiful." He paused, color rising beneath his tan. "I apologize, that was too forward." Tabitha's heart fluttered in her chest. "I do not mind," she admitted softly. "It is nice to hear, even if I am not certain I agree with your assessment. Then you do not see yourself clearly." They looked at each other again, and Tabitha felt that same sensation of something clicking into place, of recognition that went deeper than logic or reason. She forced herself to look away, to focus on breaking off another piece of bread. "My mother died 5 years ago," she said, answering his original question. "It has been just Papa and me since then. He works in Williams as a carpenter, building the new structures as the town grows. I keep the homestead running, tend the chickens in the garden, hunt and forage when I can. It is a simple life, but it is ours." "Do you ever wish for something different, something more?" Tabitha considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Williams is growing, and with it comes more people, more opportunities. I see women my age courting and marrying, starting families. Part of me wonders if that is what I should want. But most of the men in town—" She trailed off, trying to find the right words. "What about them? They look at me and see a wife who will cook and clean and bear children. Which is not wrong exactly. Those things are important. But they do not see me. They do not care about the things I think or feel or dream about. I am just a means to an end." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "What do you dream about?" No one had ever asked her that before. "I dream about seeing more of the world," Tabitha said slowly. "Not leaving Papa, but traveling together maybe. Seeing the ocean or the big cities back east. I dream about having a partner who values my mind as much as my ability to make biscuits. Someone who treats me as an equal, not as something fragile to be protected from life itself." She laughed self-consciously. "That probably sounds foolish." "It sounds honest," Jacob said, "and brave. Most people never let themselves dream that honestly." "What about you?" Tabitha asked, turning the question back on him. "What does a mountain man dream about?" Jacob's expression shuddered slightly, and Tabitha worried she had pushed too far. But after a moment he began to speak. "I came to these mountains to forget," he said quietly. "I was different then, living a different life. I had a family, a home. But there was a fire." His voice roughened. "My wife and son died in that fire. I could not save them." Tabitha's breath caught. She set down the bread and reached out to take his hand again, this time not to offer comfort during pain, but to offer compassion for a deeper, older wound. "I am so sorry," she said softly. "I cannot imagine that kind of loss. I thought if I came up here, away from everything and everyone, the pain would fade. That I could outrun the memories." Jacob's thumb moved slowly across her knuckles, and Tabitha suspected he was not even aware he was doing it. "But you cannot outrun grief. It follows you everywhere. All you can do is learn to carry it. Is that why you live alone? To avoid caring about anyone else?" "Yes," Jacob admitted. "For 3 years I have kept everyone at a distance. It is easier that way, safer, but also lonelier," Tabitha said gently. "Yes," Jacob agreed again. "Much lonelier." They sat in silence for a moment, hands still joined, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jacob squeezed her fingers gently and released them. "You should go," he said. "Your father will think I am keeping you prisoner in here." Tabitha smiled despite the heaviness of their conversation. "You are probably right. But I will check on you later, make sure you have everything you need." "Tabitha," Jacob called as she reached the door. She turned back to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Today, when I stepped between you and that bear, it was the first time in 3 years I felt like I had a reason to live. Thank you for that." Tabitha did not trust herself to speak. She simply nodded and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. She leaned against the wall in the hallway, pressing her hand to her racing heart. 3 days. Her father had said Jacob needed to stay for at least 3 days to let his wounds begin healing. 3 days to get to know this quiet, lonely man who had thrown himself into danger without hesitation to save her life. 3 days to explore whatever this was that had sparked between them in the instant their eyes first met. 3 days suddenly seemed both impossibly short and dangerously long. That evening, Tabitha prepared supper while her father tended to the chickens and horses. She made a hearty stew with vegetables from their garden and salt pork from their stores, along with fresh bread she had baked that morning. The familiar routine of cooking calmed her nerves and gave her hands something to do while her mind whirled. She kept thinking about Jacob's words, about the wife and son he had lost. The grief in his voice had been raw even after 3 years, and her heart ached for him. But beneath that grief she had heard something else. Hope, perhaps. Or at least the possibility of hope. When the meal was ready, she prepared a tray for Jacob and carried it to his room. This time when she knocked, he was standing by the small window looking out at the darkening forest. He had managed to put on the clean shirt her father had provided, though he had left it unbuttoned, presumably to avoid irritating his injuries. "You should be resting," Tabitha scolded gently as she set down the tray. "I have been resting all afternoon," Jacob replied. "I am not used to so much stillness." "Your body needs stillness to heal." Tabitha gestured to the bed. "Come, sit and eat. The stew is still hot." Jacob obeyed, settling carefully onto the edge of the bed. This time he took the spoon himself, though Tabitha noticed the slight tremor in his hand that betrayed his weakness. She sat in the chair by the small table, watching to make sure he ate properly. "Your father seems like a good man," Jacob said between bites. "How long have you been in Arizona?" "We came here 7 years ago, not long after Arizona became a territory. Papa heard there was good timber work in Williams, and we needed a fresh start after Mama got sick the first time. The higher, drier air was supposed to help her lungs." Tabitha's voice went soft. "It did for a while. We had 3 good years before the pneumonia took her. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Tabitha smiled sadly. She would have liked you, I think. She always admired people who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. "That is a kind thing to say to a stranger." "You do not feel like a stranger," Tabitha said, the words escaping before she could think better of them. "I know we only met this afternoon, and I know it makes no sense, but somehow you feel familiar. Like I have been waiting to meet you without knowing it." Jacob set down his spoon, his pale blue eyes finding hers in the gathering darkness. "I feel it too," he admitted quietly. "When I saw you in those woods, when that bear charged, something in me just reacted. Not just duty or decency, but something deeper, like protecting you was the most important thing I would ever do." Tabitha's breath caught. "Jacob, I know it is too soon," he interrupted gently. "I know we barely know each other, but I also know that life is short and unpredictable. I wasted 3 years hiding in these mountains, telling myself I was better off alone. Then you walked into my life, and suddenly that loneliness feels unbearable." Tabitha stood and moved to sit beside him on the bed, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "My father told me something today," she said softly. "He said that when he met my mother, he knew within 3 weeks that he wanted to marry her. That when you know, you just know." "And do you?" Jacob asked. "No, I mean." Tabitha turned to look at him, really look at him. She saw the strength in his weathered face, the pain in his eyes that had not dimmed his capacity for courage. She saw a man who had lost everything and survived, who had chosen to save a stranger even when it would have been safer to walk away. She saw someone who could be her partner, her equal, her other half. "I think I do," she whispered. "I think I have known since the moment you stood between me and that bear. Since the moment you looked back at me and I saw something in your eyes that matched what I felt in my heart." Jacob lifted his hand and cupped her face gently, his calloused palm rough but tender against her cheek. "I do not have much to offer," he said. "I live in a cabin up in the high country. Barely more than a shack. I make my living trapping and hunting, selling furs when I need supplies. It is a hard life, a lonely life." "It would not be lonely with 2 people," Tabitha pointed out. "And I am not afraid of hard work. What about your father? Would you leave him alone?" Tabitha had already thought about this. "Papa is still strong and capable. And Williams is only a few hours from here. We could visit regularly. And he could visit us. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I think he would be happy to see me settled with a good man. He worries about me being alone when he is gone." "Tabitha Foster," Jacob said slowly, as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I would like to know you better," Tabitha replied carefully. "That I would like to see where this feeling between us leads. And if it leads where I think it might, then yes. I would go with you into those mountains and build a life there together." Jacob's thumb stroked across her cheekbone, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him, because he smiled for the first time since she had met him. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges and making him look younger, less burdened. "I would like that very much," he said. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, but it sent warmth flooding through Tabitha's entire body. His lips were softer than she had expected, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. She brought her own hand up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath her palm. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing harder. Jacob rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face. "I did not think I would ever feel this again," he whispered. "This hope, this wanting something beyond just surviving another day. Then we will build a life worth living," Tabitha said firmly. Together. A knock at the door made them spring apart guiltily. Theodore's voice came through the wood. "Tabitha, is everything all right in there?" Tabitha stood quickly, smoothing her dress and trying to compose her flushed face. "Everything is fine, Papa. I was just making sure Jacob ate his supper properly." She opened the door to find her father standing there with an amused expression that suggested he was not fooled for a moment. "Of course you were," Theodore said dryly. "Well, do not stay too long. Jacob needs his rest, and you have had quite a day yourself." "Yes, Papa." Tabitha collected the empty tray from beside the bed, very carefully not looking at Jacob for fear her face would betray everything she was feeling. "Good night, Jacob. I hope you sleep well." "Good night, Tabitha," Jacob replied, and his voice carried a warmth that made her shiver. "Thank you for everything." Tabitha followed her father back to the main room where he settled into his favorite chair with his pipe. She busied herself cleaning the dishes, but she could feel his eyes on her the whole time. "That is a good man in there," Theodore said finally. "A bit rough around the edges, but good solid character underneath." "Yes, Papa, and unless I miss my guess, you are already halfway in love with him." Tabitha turned to face her father, no longer trying to hide what she felt. "Is that terribly foolish of me? We only just met." "Not foolish at all," Theodore said gently, "though perhaps a bit fast, even by the standards of how your mother and I courted." He paused, studying her carefully. "But I trust your judgment, daughter, and more than that, I trust what I saw between you two. There is something real there, something worth exploring. What if it does not work out? What if this feeling fades once we get to know each other better?" "That is always a risk," Theodore acknowledged. "But the greater risk is letting fear keep you from taking a chance on happiness. You have been alone too long, Tabitha. Oh, you have me, and I am grateful for every day we have together. But you need more than an aging father. You need a partner, someone to build a future with." Tears pricked Tabitha's eyes. "I do not want to leave you, Papa. I know, sweetheart, and I do not want to lose you either. But that is the way of things. Children grow up and build their own lives. That is how it should be." He smiled. "Besides, I am not so old or feeble that I cannot take care of myself, and Williams is not so far away that you could not visit whenever you wanted." Tabitha crossed the room and hugged her father tightly. "Thank you, Papa, for understanding, for not thinking I am crazy." "Not crazy," Theodore chuckled. "Just following your heart. That is what your mother would have wanted for you." That night, Tabitha lay in her small bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind too full of thoughts to allow sleep. She kept replaying the day's events, from the terror of the bear attack to the quiet intimacy of sharing that kiss with Jacob. It all felt like a dream, too strange and wonderful to be real. But the lingering warmth on her lips told her it was very real indeed. Jacob Hart had crashed into her life like summer lightning, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the summer sun painting the pines gold. Tabitha rose early and went about her morning chores with unusual energy, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, tending to her garden, and preparing breakfast for 3. When she brought Jacob his meal, she found him already awake and sitting up, looking considerably better than he had the night before. Some color had returned to his face, and his eyes were clearer. "You look better," Tabitha observed, setting the tray on his lap. She had made scrambled eggs with cheese, thick slices of bread toasted over the fire, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "I feel better," Jacob admitted, "though my ribs remind me they are still healing every time I move wrong." He looked at the generous breakfast with appreciation. "You did not have to bring this to me. I could have come out to the table." "I wanted to," Tabitha said, settling into the chair. "Besides, this gives us a chance to talk without Papa hovering like a mother hen." Jacob smiled around a bite of eggs. "He is protective of you. That is good. He is also giving us his blessing," Tabitha said quietly. "We talked last night after I left you. He said he approves of you, and he would not stand in the way if we decided to see where this could go." Jacob set down his fork, his expression serious. "That is generous of him, and faster than I expected." He paused. "Tabitha, I need you to understand what you would be agreeing to if you came with me. My cabin is small and crude. I do not have neighbors for miles. Winters in the high country are brutal. Some weeks I barely see another human soul. Does that life make you happy?" Tabitha asked. Jacob considered the question. "It made me numb," he said finally, which was what I needed at the time. "But now," he looked at her intently, "now I think that life could become something beautiful if I had the right person to share it with." "Tell me about your cabin," Tabitha said. "I want to know everything." So Jacob described it for her. His home was nestled in a small valley about 2 hours northeast of Williams, accessible only by rough trails that were barely more than game paths. The cabin itself was a single room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows that looked out over a creek. He had built it himself 3 years ago, cutting the logs and fitting them together with careful precision. He told her about the rhythm of his days, checking trap lines in winter, hunting and fishing in summer, trading furs for supplies when necessary. He described the wildlife that shared his valley, the elk and deer and mountain lions, the eagles that nested in the tall pines. He painted a picture of a life that was hard and lonely but also beautiful in its simplicity. "It sounds wonderful," Tabitha said honestly. "Challenging, certainly, but wonderful." "You would miss your father," Jacob pointed out. "Yes," Tabitha agreed, "but I would also have you. And Papa is right that Williams is not so far away. We could come down once a month, more often when the weather allows." Jacob reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I want to do this right," he said seriously. "I want to court you properly, give you time to be certain this is what you want. I do not want you to wake up one day in that cabin and regret your choice." "How long would you want to court?" Tabitha asked, her heart sinking at the thought of prolonged separation. "I need to stay here at least another 2 days for my ribs to heal enough for travel," Jacob said thoughtfully. "That gives us time to get to know each other better, to make sure this connection we feel is real and lasting. Then, once I am healed, I could stay in Williams for a while. Take a room at the boarding house, find some work to earn my keep. We could court properly with your father's supervision. And then, if you are still certain, we could be married before winter." Jacob's thumb stroked across her knuckles. "I know it is fast, but out here courtships often are. Life is too uncertain to waste time when you find someone special." Tabitha felt warmth bloom in her chest. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "The courting, the getting to know you better, all of it." They spent the rest of the morning talking, and Tabitha was amazed at how easy conversation was with Jacob. Despite his 3 years of solitude, he was surprisingly articulate when he wanted to be. He told her about growing up in Missouri, learning carpentry from his father and hunting from his grandfather. He described his first wife, Sarah, with a gentle sadness that showed he had truly loved her, and his son Michael, who had been only 4 years old when the fire took him. In turn, Tabitha told him about her own childhood in Illinois, about her mother's strength and her father's steady presence. She shared her love of reading, a passion that was difficult to indulge given the scarcity of books on the frontier. She told him about her dreams of seeing the ocean, about wanting to understand the wider world even while loving the wilderness around Williams. Theodore checked on them periodically, bringing fresh water and changing Jacob's bandages with practiced efficiency. The wounds were healing cleanly, showing no signs of infection, and Jacob's strength was clearly returning. On the second day, Jacob insisted on leaving his room and sitting with them in the main living area. He moved carefully, his ribs clearly still paining him, but he was restless from inactivity. Tabitha understood the feeling. She had always been someone who needed to be doing something productive. She watched as Jacob and her father fell into easy conversation, talking about hunting and trapping, about the best way to tan hides and preserve meat. Theodore seemed genuinely pleased with Jacob, and Tabitha could see him mentally cataloging all the ways this strong, capable man would be able to provide for and protect his daughter. That afternoon, while Theodore was outside working on repairing a section of fence, Tabitha sat beside Jacob on the bench near the window. He was whittling a piece of wood, his large hands surprisingly deft as he shaped it into the form of a bird. "What are you making?" Tabitha asked, leaning closer to watch. "A hawk," Jacob said. "I do a lot of whittling in the winter when it is too cold to do much else. Keeps my hands busy. It is beautiful." Tabitha watched the wood curls fall away, revealing more of the hawk's form with each careful cut. "You are very talented. It is nothing special, just something to pass the time." But she could see the pleased flush on his cheeks at her compliment. "Do you ever sell them? Your carvings?" "Sometimes. The trading post in Williams takes them when I bring in furs, but mostly I just make them for myself." An idea formed in Tabitha's mind. "What if you made more, taught me how, and we could both make them? We could sell them in Williams, maybe even send some to bigger towns. People back east love frontier crafts." Jacob paused in his whittling, considering. "That could work," he said slowly. "Between trapping and hunting and selling carvings, we could probably make enough to live on comfortably. Maybe even save up for improvements to the cabin, make it bigger and more comfortable." "Exactly." Tabitha felt excitement building at the prospect. "I could help with the trapping too. I am a good shot and I am not afraid of hard work." Jacob turned to look at her, his expression soft. "You really have thought about this, have you not? About what our life together could look like?" "I have thought about little else," Tabitha admitted. "Is that terrible? We have known each other for barely 2 days. Not terrible," Jacob said. He set down his knife and the half-finished hawk, then took both her hands in his. Tabitha, I need to tell you something. I am falling in love with you. I know it is too soon, I know it sounds crazy, but it is the truth. You make me want to be the man I was before the fire, before I gave up on happiness. You make me believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserve a second chance. Tabitha felt tears prick her eyes. Oh, Jacob, you always deserved a second chance. You just needed to believe it yourself. She squeezed his hands. And I am falling in love with you too, with your strength and your kindness and your courage, with the way you see me as a whole person, not just someone to keep your house and cook your meals. Jacob pulled her closer, mindful of his injured ribs but needing her near. Tabitha rested her head carefully on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to him. We are going to build something good together, Jacob said quietly. I promise you that. I will work every day to make sure you never regret choosing me. I could never regret this, Tabitha replied. Never. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the afternoon sun paint patterns on the wooden floor. Outside, they could hear Theodore whistling as he worked, and in the distance a hawk cried out as it rode the thermals high above the pines. On the third day, Jacob declared himself well enough to travel, though both Theodore and Tabitha protested. But he was clearly restless, unused to so much inactivity, and they finally relented. I will take a room at the boarding house in Williams, Jacob said as he carefully pulled on his repaired buckskin shirt. Tabitha had spent the previous evening stitching up the tears the bear had made, and while the repair was visible, the garment was serviceable. I will find work probably at the lumber mill or helping with building, and I will court Tabitha properly with permission to call on her here regularly. You are welcome here anytime, Theodore said firmly. You saved my daughter's life, Jacob. That makes you family as far as I am concerned. Jacob's eyes grew bright with emotion. That means more to me than you know, sir. None of this, sir, business. You call me Theodore. The older man extended his hand, and Jacob shook it firmly. Now let me get my wagon hitched up. I will drive you into Williams and help you get settled. While Theodore went to prepare the wagon, Tabitha walked Jacob out onto the porch. The morning was cool and fresh, the sun just beginning to burn off the mist that clung to the hollows between hills. I do not want you to go, Tabitha said softly. Even though I know you will only be a few miles away. I do not want to go either, Jacob admitted. These past 3 days with you have been the happiest I have had in years. But I need to do this right. I need to show you and your father that I am serious about building a future with you. Tabitha reached up and cupped his bearded face in her hands. You have already shown me everything I need to know about your character. But I understand why you feel this way, and I respect it. Just promise me you will come visit often. Every day that I can, Jacob promised. He bent and kissed her softly, a gentle press of lips that held more promise than passion. I love you, Tabitha Foster. I know it is soon to say it, but I do. With everything I am, I love you too, Jacob Hart, Tabitha whispered against his lips. With everything I am. The sound of wagon wheels made them pull apart. Theodore drove the wagon around to the front of the cabin, and Jacob climbed carefully into the seat beside him. Tabitha watched them drive away, her hand raised in farewell, until they disappeared into the trees. The cabin felt emptier without Jacob's presence, and Tabitha found herself drifting through her chores in a distracted daze. She kept touching her lips, remembering his kisses, or looking toward the small room where he had stayed and feeling his absence like a physical ache. But Theodore returned a few hours later with good news. Jacob had taken a room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and had already found work at the lumber mill. He would start the next day, and he had sent word through Theodore that he would call on Tabitha that very evening if she was amenable. As if there was any doubt, Theodore chuckled at his daughter's obvious excitement. You had better put on your good dress, the blue one your mother made, and maybe do something with your hair. Tabitha flew into a flurry of preparation. She washed and changed into her Sunday dress, a soft blue cotton that brought out her eyes. She braided her long brown hair and pinned it up in a style she hoped looked sophisticated rather than desperate. She even dabbed a bit of her mother's old rose water behind her ears. When Jacob arrived that evening, walking the few miles from town in the cooling twilight, Tabitha thought her heart might burst from her chest. He had bathed and shaved, though he had left his beard, and he wore clean clothes that, while simple, were clearly his best. In his hands he carried a bouquet of wildflowers he must have picked along the way. You look beautiful, Jacob said as Theodore let him in. His eyes drank in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. You look very handsome yourself, Tabitha replied. Feeling heat rise to her cheeks, she took the flowers and buried her face in them to hide her blush. These are lovely, thank you. Theodore, bless him, made himself scarce after exchanging pleasantries with Jacob. He announced he had some work to do in the barn and would be back in an hour or so, giving them privacy while maintaining propriety. Tabitha arranged the flowers in a jar of water while Jacob settled into one of the chairs at the table. She could feel the tension between them, the awareness that they had confessed their love but were now trying to navigate the more formal structure of courtship. "Tell me about your first day of work," Tabitha said, joining him at the table. "How was it?" "Hard but good," Jacob replied. "I am working with the logging crews, helping fell trees and haul timber. It is honest work and the men seem decent enough. The foreman said if I prove myself, there might be steadier work available through the winter." "That is wonderful." Tabitha leaned forward. "But what about your cabin? Your trapping? I do not want you to give up your life for me." "I am not giving it up," Jacob assured her. "I am adapting it. Once we are married, we can decide together what we want our life to look like. Maybe we spend winters at the cabin, trapping and hunting, and summers closer to Williams where you can be near your father. Or maybe we find some middle ground. The point is, we will figure it out together." They talked for hours, making plans and sharing dreams. Jacob described improvements he wanted to make to his cabin: a separate bedroom and a larger kitchen area, maybe even a small barn for horses and a milk cow. Tabitha shared her ideas for a garden in the valley, for keeping chickens and possibly goats, for creating a real homestead rather than just a trapper's shelter. "I have some money saved," Jacob said. "Not a lot, but enough to buy some basic supplies and livestock. And if I can keep this job through winter, we should have enough put aside to get properly established by spring." "Spring," Tabitha repeated, liking the sound of that. "We could marry in spring, if that is not too long to wait," Jacob said, his eyes searching hers. "I want to do this right, Tabitha. I want your father to see that I can provide for you, that I am worthy of his trust." "He already trusts you," Tabitha said, "but I understand wanting to prove yourself, and spring gives us time to prepare properly, to make sure we have everything we need before moving to the high country." Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. "I cannot believe this is real sometimes. That I found you, that you feel the same way I do. It seems too good to be true." "It is real," Tabitha promised, "as real as anything I have ever felt." True to his word, Jacob came to call on Tabitha as often as his work schedule allowed. 3 or 4 evenings a week, he would make the walk from Williams to the homestead, spending a few precious hours in her company before walking back in the dark. Sometimes Theodore stayed with them, and the three would sit around the table playing cards or simply talking. Theodore would tell stories about his younger days, about traveling west and building a life on the frontier. Jacob would share his knowledge of the mountains, teaching them both about tracking and wilderness survival. But other times Theodore would excuse himself, and Jacob and Tabitha would steal precious moments of privacy. They would sit close together on the porch, watching the stars emerge, and Jacob would hold her hand or put his arm around her shoulders. They would kiss in the shadows, sweet, tender kisses that promised more to come. As summer faded into autumn, their relationship deepened and matured. They learned each other's habits and quirks, their likes and dislikes. Tabitha discovered that Jacob was surprisingly well read for a mountain man, that he had a thoughtful, philosophical side he rarely showed. Jacob learned that Tabitha had a quick temper when riled but was also quick to forgive, and that she sang while she worked, unconscious melodies that made his heart ache with their beauty. In October, Jacob formally asked Theodore for permission to marry his daughter. Theodore, who had been expecting this, gave his blessing readily. "But I will not have her living in that tiny cabin all winter," Theodore said firmly. "You bring her back here for the coldest months, or you make that place larger and more comfortable before the wedding." "Those are my terms," agreed, Jacob said without hesitation. "I will start the improvements immediately. The cabin will be ready by spring, I promise." And so Jacob began dividing his time between his job at the lumber mill and improvements to his mountain cabin. He used his earnings to buy materials and tools, and every spare moment was spent expanding and improving his home. Theodore and Tabitha both insisted on helping. On weekends, they would make the journey up to Jacob's Valley, bringing supplies and lending their hands to the work. Tabitha fell in love with the place immediately. The cabin sat beside a clear stream surrounded by towering pines, with a view of distant peaks that took her breath away. Together, they worked through autumn, adding a separate bedroom and expanding the main living area. Theodore, with his carpentry skills, helped Jacob build proper furniture, including a real bed frame, a larger table with chairs and shelves for storage. Tabitha contributed her own touches, sewing curtains for the windows and a colorful quilt for their bed. By the time the first snows fell in November, the cabin had been transformed from a crude shelter into a real home. It was still simple, still rustic, but it was warm and sturdy and filled with promise. "This is perfect," Tabitha said on their last visit before winter closed the mountain passes. She stood in the middle of the main room, turning slowly to take it all in. "This is our home." Jacob came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "Our home," he echoed. "I never thought I would have that again. A home, a family. You have given me back everything I thought I had lost." Tabitha turned in his arms to face him. "We have given each other everything," she corrected softly. I was just going through the motions before I met you, Jacob. Living but not really alive, you changed all that. They kissed there in their future home, surrounded by the fruits of their combined labor, and it felt like a promise. A promise of all the years to come, all the joys and challenges they would face together. Winter passed slowly for both of them. Jacob continued working at the lumber mill, saving every penny he could. Tabitha spent her days at the homestead with her father, preparing her trousseau and gathering supplies for their married life. She sewed clothes for both of them, made preserves and pickles, dried herbs, and stored away seeds for spring planting. Jacob still visited when the weather allowed, though there were weeks when the snow fell too heavily for safe travel. Those weeks were the hardest, when they could only think about each other and count the days until they could be together again. But finally, winter began to lose its grip. The days grew longer, the snow started to melt, and the first brave flowers pushed up through the soggy ground. Spring had arrived, and with it their wedding day. They chose a simple ceremony in William's small church, with Theodore standing as witness along with a few friends Jacob had made at the lumber mill. Tabitha wore a dress of cream-colored cotton that she and her father had traveled to Flagstaff to purchase, the finest thing she had ever owned. Jacob wore new clothes as well, dark trousers and a white shirt, his long hair neatly trimmed and his beard freshly shaped. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Jacob kissed her for the first time as her husband, Tabitha felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "I love you," Jacob whispered against her lips. "My wife, my Tabitha, I love you," Tabitha replied. "My husband, my Jacob." They held a small celebration at the boarding house, with Mrs. Henderson providing a lovely meal and even baking a cake for the occasion. Theodore made a toast that had everyone laughing and crying at the same time, speaking about the strange ways life worked and the importance of being brave enough to seize happiness when it presented itself. As evening fell, Jacob and Tabitha said their goodbyes and began the journey to their mountain home. They rode double on Jacob's horse, Tabitha seated in front of him with his arms wrapped securely around her. The spring evening was cool but not cold, and the forest was alive with the sounds of renewal. They reached the cabin just as full darkness fell, and Jacob insisted on carrying Tabitha over the threshold despite her laughing protests that his ribs might still hurt. "I am fine," he assured her, setting her gently on her feet inside their home. "Those wounds healed months ago." Tabitha looked around the cabin which Jacob had prepared for her arrival. He had built up the fire so the room was warm and welcoming. Wildflowers sat in jars on the table and shelves. Their bed was made up with the quilt she had sewn, turned down invitingly. "It is perfect," Tabitha breathed. "Everything is perfect." Jacob came up behind her and began slowly unbuttoning the back of her dress, his fingers gentle but sure. "Are you nervous?" he asked softly. "A little," Tabitha admitted. "But mostly I am happy, so very happy." They came together slowly, tenderly, taking time to explore and discover each other. Jacob was patient and careful with her, mindful of her inexperience, and Tabitha gave herself to him with complete trust. Their lovemaking was sweet and passionate, a physical expression of all the feelings they had been building for months. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their bed, Tabitha's head resting on Jacob's chest while his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Do you remember the day we met?" Tabitha asked softly. "When that bear charged, every moment of it," Jacob replied. "It was the day my life began again, mine too." Tabitha propped herself up on her elbow to look down at him. In the firelight, his face was all plains and shadows, beautiful in its rugged masculinity. "I was so terrified, and then you were there, standing between me and death like some sort of hero from a story. I was just a man doing what needed to be done." "You were my hero," Tabitha corrected. "You still are." Jacob pulled her down for a slow, deep kiss. "And you are mine," he murmured against her lips. "You saved me just as surely as I saved you that day. You brought me back to life." They made love again as the fire burned low, slower this time, learning what pleased each other, building memories that would sustain them through all the years to come. The next morning, Tabitha woke to find Jacob already up, building up the fire and preparing breakfast. She wrapped herself in a quilt and padded over to him, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. "Good morning, husband," she said, loving the way the word sounded. "Good morning, wife," Jacob replied, turning in her arms to kiss her properly. "How did you sleep?" "Wonderfully. The best sleep of my life." Tabitha looked out the window at their valley, which was slowly emerging from the shadows as dawn broke. "I could wake up to this view every day for the rest of my life and never get tired of it." "That is good," Jacob said with a smile, "because that is exactly what you are going to do." They spent their first days of marriage exploring their valley and settling into the rhythms of married life. Jacob taught Tabitha the trails and landmarks, showing her where the best fishing was and where game trails crossed. Tabitha began planning her garden, choosing a sunny spot near the cabin that would be protected from deer and elk. They fell into an easy partnership. dividing chores by preference and ability rather than by strict gender roles. Jacob did most of the heavy labor, hunting and chopping wood and maintaining their buildings. But Tabitha proved herself an excellent shot and often brought home small game for their table. They both cooked, both cleaned, both contributed to keeping their household running smoothly. As spring turned to summer, their life together blossomed along with the wildflowers that carpeted their valley. They worked hard during the long days, but their evenings were for each other, spent sitting on their porch watching the sun set or lying in bed talking and making love. Once a month, they made the journey down to Williams to visit Theodore and stock up on supplies they could not produce themselves. Theodore always greeted them with obvious joy, delighting in his daughter's happiness and clearly pleased with the son-in-law he had gained. "You look well," Theodore told Tabitha during one such visit in early August. "Marriage agrees with you. I have never been happier, Papa," Tabitha said honestly. She glanced over to where Jacob was helping unload their wagon, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal powerful forearms. "He is everything I ever dreamed of and more. I am glad." Theodore squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be so pleased to see you settled with such a good man." That night, as they lay in bed in their mountain cabin, Tabitha told Jacob about her father's words. "Papa says Mama would have approved of you," she said softly. "I hope so," Jacob replied. "I wish I could have met her. She would have loved you," Tabitha assured him. "She always said the measure of a man was not in his words but in his actions, and your actions speak louder than any words ever could." As summer waned into autumn, Tabitha began to suspect she might be pregnant. Her courses were late, and she felt a strange new sensitivity in her breasts. She said nothing to Jacob at first, wanting to be certain, but when another month passed with no sign of her monthly flow, she could no longer deny it. She told him one evening in late September as they sat together watching the aspens turn gold on the hillsides. "Jacob, I think I am going to have a baby." Jacob turned to look at her, his eyes wide with wonder. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. I have missed 2 courses and I feel different. Tired but in a good way, and my appetite has increased." She smiled. "I think we are going to be parents." Jacob's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, joy, and then a flicker of fear. Tabitha understood. She had known about his first son, the child who died in the fire. This pregnancy must be bringing back painful memories. "Jacob," she said gently, taking his hand, "I know you are afraid, but this is not the same. We are going to be fine. Our baby is going to be fine." "You cannot promise that," Jacob said roughly. "Life is uncertain. Bad things happen to good people all the time." "You are right. I cannot promise it. But I can promise that we will face whatever comes together. And that I believe with everything in me that we are going to have a healthy, beautiful baby next spring." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I love you so much," he said, his voice breaking. "I cannot lose you. I cannot lose another child." "You will not lose us," Tabitha said firmly. "We are strong, Jacob, both of us. We are going to get through this together, and it is going to be wonderful." Over the following days, Jacob's fear gradually gave way to excitement. He became almost comically protective, insisting that Tabitha rest more and do less heavy work. She tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding that this was his way of dealing with his anxiety. They made the journey to Williams in early October to share the news with Theodore, who was absolutely thrilled at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. He insisted they spend more time in town as winter approached, worried about Tabitha being so isolated during her pregnancy. "The cabin is too remote," Theodore argued. "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby comes early?" "Papa, women have been having babies in remote places since the beginning of time," Tabitha said patiently. "I will be fine. Jacob will be with me, and we are not that far from help if we need it." But as winter closed in and Tabitha's belly began to swell with their growing child, even she had to admit there was wisdom in Theodore's concern. After much discussion, they agreed that Tabitha would move back to her father's homestead for the last 2 months of her pregnancy and the first month after the baby was born. Jacob would stay at the cabin to maintain it and keep up his trap lines, but he would visit as often as weather permitted. It was the longest separation they had endured since their marriage, and both felt it keenly. Tabitha missed waking up next to her husband, missed his steady presence and his gentle hands. Jacob rode down from the mountains whenever he could, often arriving covered in snow after pushing through dangerous conditions just to spend a few hours with his wife. On one such visit in late February, Jacob arrived to find Tabitha pacing the cabin floor, one hand pressed to the small of her back. "The baby has been very active today," she explained. "I think he or she is running out of room in there." Jacob knelt before her and pressed his hands gently to her swollen belly. Almost immediately he felt a strong kick against his palm. His face lit up with wonder. "That is our baby," he breathed. "Our child, yes," Tabitha said softly, covering his hands with hers. "Our miracle." The baby came on a cold night in early March, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected. Theodore had ridden into town to fetch the midwife, while Jacob stayed with Tabitha, holding her hand and trying not to show his terror as she labored. "You are doing so well," he told her, wiping her sweating face with a cool cloth. "You are so strong, Tabitha." "This hurts more than I expected," Tabitha gasped between contractions. "But I can do this. We can do this." The midwife arrived and took charge, and Jacob found himself relegated to anxious pacing while the women worked. It seemed to take forever, hours of Tabitha's cries and the midwife's calm instructions. Jacob thought he might go mad from the waiting and worrying. Then, just as dawn was breaking, he heard it, the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. "You have a son," the midwife called out. "A healthy baby boy." Jacob burst into the room to find Tabitha propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "We have a son," she said wonderingly. "Jacob, we have a son." Jacob approached slowly, almost afraid to believe this was real. He looked down at the baby in Tabitha's arms, at the tiny red face and the shock of dark hair. His son. Their son. "He is perfect," Jacob whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Tabitha. Thank you for this gift." They named him Michael Theodore Hart, after Jacob's first son and Tabitha's father. Theodore, who was nearly as exhausted as the new parents from worry and lack of sleep, wept openly when they told him. "I will do my best to live up to the honor," the older man said, carefully holding his tiny namesake. "He is beautiful, daughter. He looks just like his father." The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings. Tabitha recovered her strength slowly while Jacob stayed close, helping with the baby and marveling at every tiny expression and movement. "I never thought I would have this again," Jacob said one night as he rocked little Michael to sleep. "A family. A son to teach and watch grow. You deserve this happiness," Tabitha said softly. "You deserve all the good things life has to offer, Jacob. I hope you are finally starting to believe that." "I am," Jacob said. "Because of you. Because of him, you have both given me a reason to believe in second chances." When spring arrived in earnest, they loaded up the wagon and made the journey back to their mountain home as a family of 3. Little Michael seemed to thrive in the clean mountain air, and Tabitha took to motherhood with the same practical competence she brought to everything. Their life fell into new rhythms, built around the baby's needs but no less fulfilling for that. Jacob continued his hunting and trapping, but now he came home to a wife and son waiting for him. Tabitha tended her garden and kept their household running, but now she had a baby on her hip or sleeping in a cradle nearby. As Michael grew from a baby into a toddler, the cabin rang with his laughter and shouts. He was fearless like his father and curious like his mother, constantly exploring their valley and getting into harmless mischief. "He is going to be a handful," Tabitha said one evening as they watched their 2-year-old son chase chickens around their yard. "Just like his mother," Jacob teased, earning himself a playful swat. "I was never that wild," Tabitha protested. "Maybe not wild, but certainly brave," Jacob said, pulling her close. "Brave enough to trust a stranger in the woods. Brave enough to build a life in these mountains. Brave enough to love a broken man and help him heal." "You were never broken," Tabitha said seriously. "You were wounded, yes, but never broken. Your capacity to love and to sacrifice for others never diminished. It just needed the right person to bring it back to the surface." As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter, Grace, was born 2 years after Michael, with her mother's brown hair and her father's blue eyes. Then another son, Samuel, who arrived 3 years after that. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and their valley rang with the sounds of children playing and parents laughing. Theodore remained a constant presence in their lives, making the journey up to the cabin as often as his aging body would allow. He delighted in his grandchildren, teaching them the skills he had once taught Tabitha. And when he grew too old to make the journey anymore, Jacob and Tabitha brought the children down to visit him regularly. Theodore passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1889, with Tabitha holding one hand and Jacob the other. They buried him beside Tabitha's mother in the small cemetery outside Williams, and though they grieved, they also celebrated a life well lived and a father who had loved deeply. "He was a good man," Jacob said as they stood by the fresh grave. "He gave me his greatest treasure when he gave me permission to marry you." "He loved you like a son," Tabitha said, leaning into her husband's solid warmth. "He told me once that you were the answer to his prayers for me, the partner he had always hoped I would find." They returned to their mountain home with their children, and life continued its steady march forward. The children grew strong and capable, learning the skills they needed to thrive in their wilderness home. Michael became an excellent hunter and tracker. Grace developed her mother's green thumb and her father's artistic talent, creating beautiful carvings and growing an impressive garden. Samuel showed an aptitude for numbers and business, already talking about one day opening a trading post in Williams. Jacob and Tabitha grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. The passion of their early days never fully faded, but it was joined by something even stronger, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared hardships overcome, and the daily choice to love each other through both joy and sorrow. On a summer evening in 1895, nearly 17 years after the day Jacob had stood between Tabitha and a charging bear, they sat together on their porch watching the sunset. Their children were inside, Michael and Grace doing dishes while Samuel entertained them with stories. The sounds of their laughter drifted through the open windows. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked suddenly. "Marrying me? Choosing this life?" Tabitha turned to look at her husband, at the silver that now streaked his dark hair and beard, at the lines time had etched around his eyes and mouth. He was still strong, still capable, but no longer the lonely mountain man she had first encountered. He was a husband, a father, a grandfather to Michael's first child. He was loved and needed and valued. "Not for a single moment," Tabitha said firmly. She took his weathered hand in hers, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "This life we have built together, this family we have created, our children and grandchildren, this is everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dared to dream. Even on the hard days, when money was tight or the winter seemed endless. Especially on the hard days," Tabitha said, "because those were the days that proved what we have is real and lasting. Any fool can stay together when times are good. It takes true partnership to weather the storms." Jacob lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Tabitha Hart. I have loved you from the moment I saw you in those woods, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Jacob Hart, my hero, my partner, my home." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Somewhere in the forest a bear roared, the sound echoing off the mountains. But Tabitha did not flinch. She was safe here with Jacob, just as she had been safe that day 17 years ago, when he had stood between her and death, with nothing but a knife and an indomitable will. That bear attack had brought them together, had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Sometimes Tabitha wondered what would have happened if she had chosen a different berry patch that day. If Jacob had been somewhere else in the mountains, would they still have found each other? Or would they have continued on their separate paths, lonely and incomplete? But such thoughts were futile. They had found each other, had chosen each other, had built a life together that was richer and fuller than anything either had imagined possible. They had children and grandchildren who would carry their legacy forward into the future. They had a love that had been tested by time and hardship and had emerged stronger for it. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Jacob stood and offered Tabitha his hand. "Come to bed, wife. Tomorrow is another day, and I want to spend it with you." Tabitha took his hand and rose, following her husband into their home. Behind them the wilderness stretched out in all its wild beauty, the same mountains and forests that had witnessed their first meeting and every day of their lives together since. Inside they bid goodnight to their children and retired to their room. Jacob carefully banked the fire while Tabitha changed into her nightgown. Then they climbed into the bed they had shared for 17 years, and Jacob pulled Tabitha close, her head resting on his chest just as it had on their wedding night. "Thank you," Jacob whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For seeing past the broken mountain man to the person I could become with you beside me. For giving me a family and a home and a reason to believe in happiness again. For choosing me every single day for 17 years. Tabitha tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. "Thank you for being brave enough to stand between me and that bear. For seeing me as a partner rather than just a wife. For building this beautiful life with me. For choosing me every single day for 17 years. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that they had everything they needed right here. They had love and family, purpose and peace. They had weathered every storm together and would continue to do so for all the years remaining to them. And when their time finally came, decades later, they would face that final journey together as well, leaving behind children and grandchildren who carried their love forward into new generations. The cabin in the valley would remain, a testament to what two people could build when they were brave enough to take a chance on love. But that was still far in the future. For now, they simply lived day by day, savoring each moment together. The mountain man and the woman he had saved, now bound together by something far stronger than gratitude or attraction. Bound by love, partnership, and the unshakable knowledge that they had found in each other everything they had ever needed. The bear that had charged through those berry bushes all those years ago was long gone, just a memory now. But the love it had inadvertently sparked burned as bright as ever, a beacon of hope and happiness in the wilderness, and it would continue burning, warming their family for generations to come, a legacy as enduring as the mountains themselves.